afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you are on the West Coast. Welcome and thank you all for being here. My name is Alyssa Haydari and I am the Deputy Director of the IIP. Today, we are hosting a very special presentation by Nathan Williams, the federal prosecutor who investigated and tried the man who killed 9 people in a church in Charleston 5 years ago. I suspect many of you vividly remember hearing about this horrific crime on the news and the deeply disturbing background of Dylann Roof as the case was widely publicized in the media. We are incredibly lucky to have Mr. Williams tell us more about the lives lost that horrible day in Charleston, South Carolina, and his experience handling the case through trial. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to take the time to read the IIP's land acknowledgement statement. We want to acknowledge that the IIP and John Jay College are based in New York City, which is Lenape-Hoking, the Lenape homeland. We honor all of the indigenous nations and their land with great gratitude and acknowledge the genocide and continuous displacement of indigenous people. We also acknowledge the enslaved Africans whose labor built Manhattan during the colonial era and beyond. We acknowledge the harm inflicted upon indigenous communities and people of color across the country, which inspires our ongoing work. Now, before I introduce Mr. Williams, I want to get to a few housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded like all of our panels, but we may redact certain images for the version that is eventually posted on our website. So we ask that those of you watching the presentation live today do not capture or disseminate any of the images shown today. And second, for those of you seeking New York CLE credit, our application for accreditation is still pending, but we hope to get approved for this course soon. So if you are an experienced attorney seeking credit, please record all attendance verification codes announced during the program and email your affirmations and evaluations to the address indicated in the chat feature of your screen. And if and when we do get confirmation that the course will be accredited by the board, we will send you a certificate of attendance for your records. Now with that, let's get to the presentation. For time's sake, I will not read all of Mr. Williams' very impressive accomplishments, but you can see his full bio in a link that we're going to drop in the chat feature. I will tell you that Nathan Williams is the criminal chief of the United States Attorney's Office in the District of South Carolina. In the last several years, Mr. Williams has tried 2 death penalty cases. His trial of Mr. Roof, the one we're going to be talking about today, was the first capital prosecution of a federal hate crime. Mr. Williams has been an assistant United States attorney since 2009. Before that, he was a state prosecutor for 10 years. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thank you all for tuning in this afternoon or morning as the case may be. First, I want to thank the IIP for inviting me for this presentation today, and I want to thank you all for joining. It's a little unusual for me to present this sort of remotely or virtually, so if there's some lag in video, I apologize for that. And I certainly want to take questions. We're going to do those through the chat process, and I will certainly try to answer those questions and direct the presentation towards your questions as we go. But again, it's certainly a privilege of mine to be able to present to you all. You know, as a prosecutor, as a career prosecutor, I look forward to chances to talk about cases and to get people's feedback. And I know a lot of you all are prosecutors yourselves. So I certainly welcome any questions, any discussion you all are interested in. A couple other quick things. It's a case study. I'm going to talk about the case, but I will say that anything that I present here is publicly available, whether they were exhibits at trial that are available through the South Carolina Clerk of Court or otherwise are publicly available in the media. As Alyssa had mentioned, we will redact some things, but having said that, this is all publicly available information. So what I want to talk about briefly is the case occurred. You all may be familiar with it. Alyssa mentioned it. It was the murder or the hate-based murder of 9 parishioners at the Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. I work in Charleston. I'm not from here, I'm from Michigan, but I've been here almost 20 years now, and it's certainly home. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what went into the investigation of the case, what went into the prosecution. But I do want to start by saying, you know, that the turnaround to trial in this case was extremely fast. that the crime occurred on June 17th of 2015, and we started trial in November with jury selection of 2016. So about a year and a half from time of crime to trial. As most of you know, that's a very fast timeline in any court, let alone in federal court, and it's exceptionally quick in a capital case. So having said that, we had 5 attorneys on the case. I was one of 5 prosecutors, and I certainly did not carry any greater role than the other 4 folks that were on the case. Another AUSA out of our office, Jay Richardson, was on the case. We had 2 attorneys out of the Civil Rights Division with DOJ, as well as Rich Burns, who's out of the capital case section. So I'm going to present today, and I certainly worked on the case largely in the investigative phase and the guilt phase of the trial presentation, but I also want to be clear that there was a lot of folks who put time and effort into our investigation and convictions. So to get started, the Mother Emanuel or Emanuel AME churches in Charleston, South Carolina, as I mentioned, is where I live. And you know, it's important to know that Charleston is known as the holy city, and there's sort of anecdotal evidence, as you can see from the image in the PowerPoint, that the church spires and the churches in the city of Charleston are said to be the limitation of how high things can be built. And so the skyline in Charleston is predominantly seen through the steeples of the churches, and religion and churches in Charleston are really an important part of the fabric. Mother Emanuel was one of the, and is one of the most prominent churches in Charleston. It has a tremendous history. It goes back pre-Civil War, and it is closely linked to the history of South Carolina, the history of Charleston, and in a lot of ways, the history of our country. You know, in trying to learn about Mother Emanuel and get information about the church and its history, we came across a very interesting video that Clementa Pinckney, one of the individuals killed in the church, put together. He was the pastor at Mother Emanuel. And, you know, as many times as I've tried to tell the story of the church, I frankly cannot do it any better than him. So what I'm going to do is play a short clip of that video where he talks about some of the history of the church and where he talks about some of the Civil War history of the church and its relevance in South Carolina.
My name is Reverend Clementa Pinckney, and as of a couple of weeks ago, I'm in my 4th year of pastoring here at the church, and along with pastoring here at Mother Emanuel, since the year 2000, it's been my privilege to serve the people in South Carolina Senate District 45 in the state legislature. Where you are is a very special place in Charleston. And it's a very special place because this church and this site, this area, has been tied to the history and life of African Americans since about the early 1800s. This church was built in 1891. The congregation was formed in 1818 by the Reverend Morris Brown, who later became the 2nd bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And for those of you who may know a little something about our denomination, we started in 1787 through our founder, Richard Allen, who left then St. George's Methodist Episcopal Church because they were telling him he needed to pray after the regular members prayed. And so that's how the denomination began, in a fit of civil disobedience and a little issue with theological fairness, if you will. So with that,
I'm going to pause that there. I think it gives you a little bit of a feel, first of all, for the inside of the church, and second of all, for the person that Reverend Clementa Pinckney was. And I apologize for some of the lag there. That's on my end. My computer just doesn't like to pull video too fast through PowerPoint. So apologize for that little bit of lag. And so in this video, Clementa Pinckney goes on to talk about how during the Civil War era, the Emanuel AME Church played a pivotal role in being just in the outside of the city boundaries, where freed African Americans lived, but under the close watch of the city, and specifically in an effort to prevent slave revolts or uprisings. Denmark Vesey was a pastor at the church. He led a uprising there, and that was a significant part, not of just the history of Charleston, but the history of the country. And so the church continued to play that role through the Civil War, through the Civil Rights era. And the history there was, not lost on Dylann Roof. Anything that I have talked about or anything that I've gone through is sort of known to the general public. You can find that on Wikipedia, and certainly there's nothing, out there that Dylann Roof wasn't aware of. And what we learned later was that he targeted Mother Emanuel because of its history. He targeted Mother Emanuel because he knew that history would create a degree of attention that he couldn't get otherwise. And this is Mother Emanuel AME Church. It's on Calhoun Street. Charleston is a very touristy city. There's a lot of folks that sort of are in the same area up and down what's called King Street. It's sort of a major tourist area, and there's hotels sort of surrounding the church. But the church itself sort of sits out of the way and is not quite as busy sort of during the day or at night. In the areas around the church, there's some residential areas, there's some students, but it's a fairly quiet part of town given sort of the surrounding areas. The church at the time did not have internal security cameras. I think that was, this was in 2015. There had been church shootings prior to that, but this was the first time that I think it really got on a lot of folks' radar that churches were effectively soft targets. Schools, movie theaters, and we saw this sort of increasing number of mass shootings and sort of the internet notoriety that was going along with it. And so, Dylann Roof was aware that churches were a soft target, and he certainly targeted Mother Emanuel for that reason. But, as maybe not be so common now, at the time, there were not cameras inside the church. However, there were cameras on the outside, and the 3 red arrows here show where the external surveillance was. And, I think, as you can see from those locations, largely to surveil the parking lot for reasons of security. What we did almost immediately in the investigation was to go back, pull that video, and try to ascertain what was going on in the church leading up to the shootings and the hours, if not the day prior to the shootings. And I think what we found was, the folks that were in the Bible study were the folks that were not just the weekend, Sunday parishioners, but the Wednesday Bible study folks. And we captured most of them coming into the church, and that's where I'll start talking about the events that led up to the shooting. The first person that came into the church was Sharonda Coleman Singleton. Sharonda was a preacher, like most of the folks that were in the Bible study. That day at the church, they were going to have a business meeting leading up to the actual Bible study. And so we saw folks coming in early. They were giving out some preaching certificates. Then afterwards, going to have their usual Wednesday Bible study. And so Sharonda was a powerful preacher. She was the type of preacher that folks traveled to see. And like a lot of the folks that were killed, she was also a mother, and a proud mother. And she was a track coach and a huge part of the community. You see her here with her children. They're a little bit older now. But to your left or her right is her son, Chris Singleton. Chris ended up being drafted by the Chicago Cubs, played minor league baseball, and then has had a career recently sort of in some reality TV shows, and you may see him here and there, but an incredible speaker, and really turned this tragedy into a very positive thing in his life and for his family. The next person we saw come in is Suzie Jackson. Suzie Jackson was one of the matriarchs of the church. Anything around the church that has a name on a plaque there's a Jackson name on it. She was the one who sort of looked after the senior citizens and would call on them every day that were part of the church. And you see her here coming in at about 1:30 in the afternoon. Suzie was 87 years old. It speaks a little bit to Suzie's, I'll show you here quickly, Suzie's family, mostly from the northeast from the Baltimore area. It speaks a little bit to Dylann Roof to know that, you know, when Suzie Jackson was in the church when she was killed, she was shot 11 times. And, you know, we talk about hate crimes and we can talk about what that means, but, you know, when an individual shoots an 87-year-old woman from very close range 11 times, I think that is sort of the type of definitions we look for when prosecuting these cases, especially in the capital context. The next person I'm going to show you is Ethel Lance. Ethel Lance, we didn't capture her coming in. There was a front door to the building that did not have a surveillance camera. Ethel was the sexton of the church. She was a caretaker. You see her on your left with some of her family members on Selfie Sunday. This was the Sunday before the shootings. And then you see her on the other side with her family. And, you know, the picture is very fitting. She was the fabric that held her family together. You know, we saw a lot of things happen with different families. And, you know, some families got together and were closer. Some families struggled. And it was largely a component of the individuals in those families. And, you know, Ethel's family struggled. Her son, Gary, who's above her to the right, really relied on Ethel, and it was really hard on him. He couldn't speak, with special needs, deaf and mute, was strong during the trial, but really struggled without her there. And so we saw some of the dependence and the loss certainly reflected in Ethel Lance's family. DePayne Middleton is the next person we see coming in. She was also a preacher, a powerful preacher, also well known as a mother who had 4 very distinct daughters who were very tall, very athletic, and DePayne was well known to encourage their athletic performances, often giving coaches a hard time if she didn't think her kids were getting the right attention. But she was known for having those 4 children following behind her like ducklings, some people would say. And they were actually going to be at the Bible study that night. They had been in the past, but the children had some car problems and ended up not being there the night of the shooting. Dan Simmons Sr. was another preacher. He was also a pastor at the church and one of the higher up preachers. He was the one that was generally the sort of mentor for the other preachers and taught a lot of folks as they became preachers and helped them earn their certificates. You see him here preaching. He was known as the backbone of the church. He had a military background, had been a counselor, and, you know, I'll talk about this in a little bit, but, you know, Dan Simmons, no surprise given that background, when the shooting started, was the first one to get up and run at Roof. Roof shot Clementa Pinckney first. Simmons ran at him, said, "You shot my preacher," then was shot several times himself, got to the door, fell, and as he lay in the doorway, was shot as Roof left the building. Like a lot of other folks, you know, a preacher, a man of the community, but also a family man. And you see him here, I think, as proud as can be with his son and grandson and granddaughter all getting their college degrees at the same time. The next person I'm going to talk about is Myra Thompson. Myra, in these videos, is very hard to capture. Anytime we would find her somewhere, she would be gone in a second or two. So what we did see was her hugging people, saying hello to them, greeting them in every picture. And she was sort of known as a busybody of the church. She had the attention of everyone and knew what was going on. She was receiving her preaching certificate that night. And, you know, the plan that night was that she was going to give the Bible study for the first time, lead the Bible study after she got her preaching certificate. And she was very excited about that. She was about to retire as well and was retiring into the ministry with her husband, who you see on your right, Tony Thompson. They were going to retire into the ministry. And that night, Myra was leading the Bible study. You know, several folks who were in the Bible study were there in support of Myra. You know, one of the folks, Cynthia Hurd, that was going to leave. The Bible study was running late, and she had said that she would stay and stay with Myra because she loved her and wanted to support her. And so you see her here with her children as well. One of the things that has sort of happened afterwards, her husband, Tony, is a preacher as well. And, you know, on the anniversary of the shooting, he would use the notes she took for the Bible study that she prepared and use those to lead the Bible study on the 1-year anniversaries. This is Tywanza Sanders. He was the youngest one killed in the shooting. And you see him with his parents, 2 very impressive people as well. Tyrone and Felicia Sanders. We did not have video of Tywanza coming into the church. I think he probably came in the front door, but I think, it sort of tells you what you need to know about Tywanza. He was 26 years old and he was at a Bible study on a Wednesday night at 8 o'clock. So he was an impressive young man. He had a ton of ability and a ton of ambition, always getting his education, always working, really just sort of a hustler who was always working hard to get ahead. And, a lot of people expected a lot of him. I'm not sure anybody could have anticipated these circumstances, but as I'll talk about in a little bit, when Roof opened fire, Tywanza was hit almost immediately. And his mother, Felicia, who's in the picture here, and Felicia's 11-year-old daughter were next to Tywanza. Tywanza was bleeding, and Roof was walking around the tables, shooting folks that were hiding under the tables. And as he came around to the end of the table, Tywanza was, Felicia sort of had to make a decision. She knew Tywanza was hit. He was bleeding because he was hit in the throat. And she decided between Tywanza and the 11-year-old granddaughter, and certainly, in a difficult choice, chose to pretend that she was dead, grab the 11-year-old, hold her tight, and actually got blood from Tywanza on her in an effort to look like she had been hit. Tywanza would have been clearly aware of that, and as Roof came around the end and got into proximity of him and his mother and the 11-year-old, spoke up. And although he was shot, he was able to raise up onto his elbows, get up to where he could address Roof, and did do that. And I think in what has been widely reported in is a very impressive statement: no harm, you don't need to do this. And so, an impressive young man certainly sacrificed his life for his family, and I don't think people were frankly surprised by that. And, in doing so, Roof shot him several more times, killing him, but did not shoot his mother or the 11-year-old or anybody else sort of in that Bible study at that point. So he effectively disrupted Roof, and in the process was certainly killed as a result. There's a quick video I want to show here of Tywanza. He made a video to promote his poetry and his guitar playing. I'm going to play a quick clip. I think it captures him.
My name is Tywanza Sanders. I'm from Charlotte, South Carolina. I'm from Marlon. Y'all will see me all over the place.
And his family had put together a video for us and for his ceremony and memorial they have for him every year. And that was a clip that he had put together himself. I think borrowed the money from his father, Tyrone had said. The next folks we see coming through are going to be Reverend Clementa Pinckney. You see him here with his wife and his two daughters. So Clementa Pinckney was certainly a public figure, a state senator, gave tremendously of himself to the community, was a pastor, the lead pastor at Mother Emanuel, but he was really a family man sort of beneath that. And I think, although his family certainly shared him with the public, he was a strong family man and devoted to those two young girls. When you see him on the video here, you'll see him, I think, really sort of captures him with his wife and one of his daughters coming into the church. His wife and daughter were in the office inside the building when the shooting occurred. They were not out in the open. They were able to hide under a desk. Shots went through that room, but they were not hit. As you see walking up now is Cynthia Hurd. She was another victim in the shooting. She was a librarian, a career librarian getting close to retirement. And she is showing Clementa a diagram she made for the church for the business meeting. Folks at the library talked about her printing it up that day and how excited she was to bring it in to show the history of the church. She was a person who worked as a manager at a local library, worked at night at the College of Charleston Library, and was nonstop work, constantly giving to the community, close to retirement. But she was also just an inspiration to her family. One of her brothers, as a young boy, talked about how he wanted to be a truck driver when he grew up, and that Cynthia encouraged him to be more than that, and that he listened to that, and she constantly pushed him, and he ended up being a member of the North Carolina State Senate.
And, you know, the stories like that were countless. The week that she was killed, her sister was diagnosed with cancer. And the first thing Cynthia said was, "I've got you. I'm coming up to Virginia to be there." And, you know, came up with a plan to get her better. So, you know, to a person, outstanding individuals. And, you know, we captured some of that. And I think it's sort of clear from Clementa's video and Cynthia's, the type of folks they were, at least in a limited way. The next section we have is shortly after, about 8:15, so the Bible study would have started. And this is when Roof pulls up in his car, and you know that the license plate was indicating the Sons of the Confederate Memorial, we later determined. And this shows him coming in on the way into the Bible study.
Sorry.
Yeah, thanks, Alyssa. And I've been through these CLEs before, so I'll pause whenever I can. I understand that process, certainly. And so this is Roof going into the church. You know, it's notable that the church was old, had very thick walls, very thick doors. A couple of things to note about him coming in. You know, at the time, this was in an area around the College of Charleston, so it wasn't unusual for college students to sort of come into the church, whether they needed something or, you know, or just to be there for service. So, you know, it wasn't unusual to have somebody Roof's age come into the church. I think what we would all notice now is the tactical pouch he has on his waist. They didn't think anything of it at the time. So in the tactical pouch, as you'd expect, he had a .45 Glock semi-automatic pistol. He had 8 clips, each clip loaded with 11 rounds. And as I'll get to later, really symbolic of some of his white nationalist and white supremacist ideals. 88 being symbolic of HH, or the 8th letter of the alphabet, for Hail Hitler. And so he worked in this sort of symbolism into the crime, had thought about it, deliberated, frankly, for a very long time. And so, you know, it may raise some questions now, certainly, but at the time, when Roof walked into the church, I believe Sharonda said, "Pastor, we have a visitor." They pulled out a chair for him. He sat with them. They gave him a Bible and the notes from the Bible study, and he sat with them and went through the Bible study with them. This is a little bit of the outline or the makeup of the church. What we saw earlier with Clementa Pinckney was the main part of the church. This is the sort of the basement, it's about 3 or 4 steps down. But this is where they held a lot of they had weddings, parties, and things like that, Bible studies. And so it's where they met. They met around the 4 tables there that are sort of in the middle. This is where they were seated. And towards the end, which will be the left of the screen near Tywanza, were the 3 folks that survived there. So right around him was Polly Shepard, as well as Felicia and the 11-year-old granddaughter. So this is where they sat. And when Roof came in, he went right to the area next to Clementa. But I'm going to show a couple of quick clips, as I guess a lot of 26-year-olds would do. As Tywanza was in the Bible study, he took a Snapchat and were able to pull that from a friend's device and capture some images off of that. So this shows Dan Simmons, who was sort of working in the Bible study with Myra leading it. That's him sort of directly across. Roof would have come in and sat down right next to Clementa Pinckney. As I said, they gave him a Bible and notes. And from this clip, you can see from the screenshot, you can see the row of where folks are seated with Roof on the far right, then Myra Thompson with the lighter hair, and then DePayne closest in. So that kind of shows from the Snapchat video where the folks were around the tables. So what happens is he sits there for, I mean, by the best estimate, maybe 40 minutes. You know, went along with the Bible study, laughed at some things that DePayne said about her family. And although he didn't contribute significantly, he was interacting with them in a way that didn't raise any kind of concerns. Towards the end of the Bible study, they had a tradition of doing what's called the mitzvah benediction. And it's taken from Genesis 31:49. I'm gonna have to read this because I can't remember it. But the general prayer reads, "May the Lord watch between me and thee when we are absent one from the other." And so it was a tradition of theirs towards the end of the Bible study to stand, join hands, close their eyes, and go through this benediction, through this prayer. Knowing Roof and knowing what was in his mind, it's certainly no surprise that he took that opportunity when they were most vulnerable to open fire. Eyes closed, in prayer, standing. He pulls the .45 from his tactical pouch and just opens fire across the room. The first shots went to what would be Roof's right and then down the side. And as those shots were fired down the side, Tywanza was hit, DePayne was hit and injured. I believe Myra was hit. We could only tell so much from some of the physical evidence. Most likely, Sharonda was killed and hit several times. And as soon as that happens, Clementa Pinckney stands up, heads that way, falls, and is shot several more times. And Dan Simmons, at that point, jumps from his seat, says, "You shot my pastor," goes at Roof and is shot several times himself. It's hard to imagine the right way to react in that situation. I think this was at a time, again, where, these kind of mass shootings in a church there had been some. The Sikh temple, I think in Wisconsin, had happened, so it wasn't unprecedented, but it certainly didn't have the sort of public awareness that I would say it does now. And so, folks there just didn't frankly know what to do. Although Dan Simmons rushed at Roof and was shot, the rest of the folks sort of just jumped under the tables. And those tables are, typical sort of tables you'd expect in a church basement, plastic with paper or plastic covers, and frankly did not provide much protection at all from gunfire. So the folks all jumped under the tables, took cover, and at that point, Roof really just walked through the church, shooting folks multiple times from feet away as they lay face down. Folks praying, folks found in their hands clasped as they're praying. Really just executions in the truest sense of that word. So once people are under the tables, he then proceeds to kind of walk around, shooting the folks as they're on the ground. Again, some folks praying and multiple times. Cynthia Hurd was shot 7 times. She was the librarian, laying face down, and he shot her from probably 2 or 3 feet away. Myra was probably already hit when Roof came around to this side. She was shot seven times in total while laying under the table, facing where Cynthia was. DePayne was probably shot in the first barrage because of some of the trajectory of her injuries. She was shot a total of 9 times. Sharonda, probably shot early on, was shot 5 times. And Ethel Lance was shot a total of 6 times. Suzie Jackson, who I said was sort of the matriarch of the church, was down at the end, and she was also the aunt of Felicia Sanders, and so related to Tywanza and Felicia as well. Roof came around to the end of the table there, and as I mentioned before, as he goes by, shoots Suzie Jackson 11 times. And as I mentioned before, that's sort of about as strong of circumstantial evidence as you'll get of hate in a very direct way. I think I mentioned before, he had 11 rounds per clip, shot her at least 11 times. And, I think what that tells us is that he stood over her at 87 years old, face down, and shot her 11 times, but went through a whole clip. So, kept firing until he had no rounds left. So what happens as he gets around the end of the tables is Polly Shepard, who was a survivor, was down on this end. And Polly had worked in some prisons before, certainly didn't have a lot of familiarity with guns or anything like that. But as Roof came around the end of the tables, she was praying out loud. And so in that praying, I think that distracted him a little. He began talking with Polly, told her to shut up, and then started telling her, "I'm 21 years old, I have to do this." And that is when Tywanza interjected and sort of disrupted him, one from Polly, but also from Felicia and the 11-year-old who were near him. So at that point in time, as Roof is at the end of the tables, Tywanza somehow manages to get up onto his elbows, address Roof, say, you don't have to do this. We mean you no harm. And he is shot several more times and killed there. But once that happens, Roof doesn't kill any of the folks that are still in the church. He leaves Felicia, the 11-year-old, and Polly, and tells Polly, I'm gonna leave you here to tell my story, is what he said at the time. Dan Simmons has moved. He is shot several times. He heads to the door over here where Roof came in, the same one he leaves. As Roof leaves, he shoots Dan Simmons at least once more, probably twice, based on the evidence on the scene, as he's walking over him, and otherwise leaves the victims that survived still in the church. Tywanza is shot. Tywanza actually lives for a short period after he's shot, as does Dan Simmons. Dan Simmons passes away on the way to the hospital. Tywanza survives up to the point where first responders show up. He's actually able to direct some of the first officers that come in to the direction Roof went. His mother was there with him, as was a sergeant when he passed away. They sat over him, talking with him, Felicia telling him to calm down, but eventually, he was certainly injured severely and died as a result. But his mother was there with him, and as the sergeant described at trial, squeezed the sergeant's hand and sort of took his last breath as the two of them were there with him. He had his one hand outstretched to his aunt, who also had passed away. I think significant of what his concerns were in the last moments of his life. So once those statements are made, Roof then walks through the end of the tables and back out the door that he came in. In total, he fired 74 rounds from a 45 caliber Glock handgun. Just as an indication of how close he was, 62 of those rounds hit one of the people killed. No one was shot fewer than 5 times, and as I mentioned before, the most was 11, and to a person they were taking cover, vulnerable, at worst a distance away, and except for Dan Simmons, were all taking cover and certainly no threat or any danger to the defendant. Now, what's interesting is, I showed the picture of the church earlier. It's a fairly heavily populated area, but nobody heard a sound out there. Those doors and those walls are heavy, they're thick, and certainly, I think Roof had said later he expected to see law enforcement response, but when he came outside, there simply wasn't anyone there. This is the next video that shows Roof leaving the church at about 5 after 9. And so what you see there is Roof leaving. He gets in his car, drives away. The video took a little time to recover. The initial law enforcement response was to set up a perimeter, thinking he was on foot. The folks inside the church reported he left on foot. Unfortunately, they set up a perimeter, but the car was well outside of it by the time they were able to do that. So although they had the right response, they were not able to contain him within the perimeter, and he was pretty well, I'm sure, outside of town based on the evidence we had. By the time they were able to sort of start looking for him. This is a 911 call that came from Polly Shepard. I'll play that briefly.
And 911, what's the address of the emergency? Emmanuel Church, there's plenty people shot down here. Please send somebody right away. Emmanuel Church? Emmanuel, every 110 Camels. And there's people shot? Yeah, he shot the pastor. He shot all the men in the church. Please come right away. Okay, my partner's going to be getting some help on the way while I get a little bit more information from you, okay? Stay on the line with me. Are you safe? He's still in here, I'm afraid. He's still in here. Where are you? I'm in Emmanuel AME Church on 110. Yes, ma'am, but where are you inside the church? In the lower level. You're in the lower level? Where is the shooter? He's in the office. Please send somebody right with me.
Yes, ma'am. I've got officers en route to you. Don't hang up with me. I want you to stay on the line with me. You stay as quiet as possible. Do you hear me?
Yes, I'm under the table.
What is your name, ma'am?
Polly Shepherd.
All right, Miss Polly. Like I said, my partner's getting some help on the way while I get this information from you, okay? You stay on the line with me.
He's coming, please.
Okay, ma'am, are you able to, if he's coming, I need you to be as quiet as possible. Is there something that you can hide under?
I'm under the table.
Did you see him at all?
Yes, he's a young 21-year-old white dude.
Okay.
Please, we got some people very hurt, please.
Yes, ma'am. And you said that, were you able to see the gun? Do you know what kind of gun it was?
No, I don't know. I don't know anything about guns.
Okay, that's okay. And where are the weapons now?
He's got it in his hand. He's reloading.
He's reloading? Okay, I need you to bear with me, okay? How many shots has he fired?
I don't know. There's so many. 3 different rounds.
Okay.
I'm going to pause that there. I think you all get a sense of sort of what was presented. So Polly believed obviously that Roof was still in the church. When we went back and were able to sync up the external video with the 911 calls, we determined that he wasn't. I think she perceived it that way, and there was certainly noise, and you can hear Tywanza in the background making some noise. Felicia was talking to Tywanza, and I think they were moving some things, so I think there was some sound there that she detected as Roof, but her perception was that he was in the church still and reloading, but I think it was pretty clear by the time we synced things up that he actually left the church at that point in time. So as far as the law enforcement response, I'll speak to this in a moment, but a shooting of this magnitude in an area like Charleston, the regional population of maybe now close to 1 million, really strained the resources of local police departments. So it was really an all hands on, and that included federal agents, the FBI, and the way we ran the investigation was to sort of divvy up FBI leads with local leads. We brought in ATF, we brought in every federal agent that could, and started running leads throughout the night and into the next morning to try to locate any information we had. We're working off the car in the parking lot, running down every make and model that was similar to that in the area. And really in the overnight process, determined that probably the best thing to do was to release a still from the video. Took a little while to get that, and it's not always there's some risk in doing that, right? You can alert the target that he's been known, but I think it was pretty clear that he was not concealing his identity. And so a still was released overnight, and by the next morning we started getting leads and tips coming in on the shooting. And so it was a significant event in the history of Charleston, and certainly at the time required some crisis response. And it came right on the heels of the Michael Slager shooting, which y'all may remember. Walter Scott was killed by a North Charleston Police Department officer, another civil rights case that was prosecuted out of our office. Michael Slager was sentenced to 20 years federally for civil rights violations, excessive force violations. And so these came within months of each other. The trials were within months of each other, and certainly added to the atmosphere in the Charleston area, and in some ways reflected the atmosphere in the country as a whole. This is a picture of Tony Thompson. To say it was chaotic that night is maybe an understatement, but it was quiet at first. And then once things got out, it felt like every police officer with a blue light was showing up and trying to help. And, these folks who had family members, it was hard. It's just Tony, who knew his wife was leading the Bible study, had heard there was a shooting, and was just trying to get in to see if she was safe. And clearly she wasn't. But, he broke down. I mean, there's another photo from the news where he just collapsed on the sidewalk, understandably. It was a difficult case for those police folks that were the law enforcement officers, but you know, they couldn't let the family in at that point in time. And, you know, we had a strong push of resources. FBI brought their rapid response team, DOJ folks from victim advocates, and I think, you know, did a good job doing as much as we could. But, you know, it was extremely difficult early on to not be able to give information to the folks whose family members were killed. I will say, you know, later on we were able to do some things, and, you know, one thing that I recall is Felicia Sanders, when she left, the church left her Bible inside, and, you know, all the biohazard stuff was taken, put in a dumpster in biohazard bags and thrown out. And, you know, the victim advocates believed that her Bible probably was in there. You know, they went to the dumpster, jumped inside of it, you know, went through everything, including the biohazard, found her Bible. It had blood on it. It had bullet holes in it. Took it, got it professionally cleaned, and were able to get that back to her. You know, she brought that Bible in when she testified at trial, and still had the bullet holes, still had the blood on it. And she said, you know, several times that you could wash it, but the stain of the blood was still there. And so it was an incredible group of folks. And I feel like some of the DOJ rapid response victim advocates handled it in a way that did them some service. You know, a few sort of logistical things, and I'm getting close to being done here, so I'm going to go through it quickly. But, you know, I think when you deal with these mass shootings, there's a few exponential concerns. Dealing with state and local coordination, we have good relations locally. That did not really become a problem. But the exponential demand of elected official visits, media management, funeral arrangements, you know, when the president shows up, the vice president, that's going to divert the executive team from the police department, from our office, from every office, and it's a huge strain on sort of resources. So those of you that are prosecutors, you know, you have to have a game plan in mind, and then understand even when you have a game plan, it's you've got to trust your folks. I mean, we were making major decisions in real time with our executive folks sort of pull away to the media, and that's just it's a challenge. It's certainly not an unprecedented one, but, you know, between law enforcement and in our office, we were stretched. And, you know, I think it shows the sort of the why you need some of that federal assistance, because, you know, the Charleston Police Department was fully utilized dealing with the media and the elected officials business. When you get the president in town and the vice president for a funeral, that's going to pull a lot of your local resources into it. So it was good to have the local relationships and those pre-existing sort of strategies in place. The local reaction was certainly what you would expect. You know, it was a high-profile crime, and this is a photo of a unity walk that was done over the bridge, sort of shows support for the victims in the case. Roof was arrested the next day. You know, he had the distinctive bowl cut haircut that people saw in the news. A woman up in Shelby, North Carolina, just outside of Charlotte, recognized him, called him in, and then he was arrested there. I'm going to show a quick clip. You know, this is the next day, early afternoon. He's interviewed by FBI agents who were in closer proximity than the local police. And so 2 of the FBI officers or agents conducted the interview.
I know what you're talking about. Well, can you tell us about what happened last night?
Yeah, I mean, I went to that church in Charleston, and I did it.
You did what? I know stuff sometimes to say.
It's not that I don't want to say it because I don't want to make myself seem guilty. I just don't really like saying it.
No, sometimes we have to face those things, the realities.
You don't want to put any words in your mouth. That's why that's why Agent Stansbury is asking what it exactly is that you did do.
Well, I
So did you shoot him? Yes. What kind of gun did you use? A Glock 45.
And so I think, there was this interview was a solid 2 hours, and one thing that jumped out was a lot of the laughter, sort of the inappropriate laughter, and certainly the lack of sort of remorse or concern given the sort of closeness in time to the shootings. I think he laughed maybe 70 times throughout that video, and that resonated with a lot of the victims, especially in the Capitol context. It just, was noteworthy, I guess, for a lot of reasons. So, a lot of folks ask about Dylann Roof's background and whether there's anything that, jumped out. And frankly, not a whole lot. I mean, in a lot of these sort of mass shootings, there's not a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of red flags that people can latch onto. So, he had divorced parents, grew up in the Columbia, South Carolina area, had some interactions with law enforcement, but nothing that really put him on the law enforcement radar. And not a lot of evidence of, there was some indications of racist ideology and some stuff that was found online through the investigation, but nothing that was drawing a ton of attention of law enforcement at the time. Really what we found was that he had kind of gotten, I'm not going to say internet radicalized, but that concept certainly applies, where, a lot of the information he gained was off the internet. Sites such as Stormfront and Daily Stormer claimed that it was sort of the Trayvon Martin case that awakened him to, his beliefs, and then really jumped on white nationalism and white supremacy and promoted a lot of sort of racial divide. And so that was sort of the, I don't want to say the wormhole, but the wormhole he went down was this white nationalism and, the idea that he would somehow be a savior or an icon. And then, unfortunately, a lot of folks have paid him some attention since then, but certainly that was his goal, was to portray himself in a certain way and to express certain ideologies. I'll talk briefly, I've got about 8 or 9 minutes, about the charges, but certainly the death eligible capital offenses were obstruction of the exercise of religion and the use of a firearm to commit murder during a crime of violence, and then certainly hate crimes as a sort of lead charge. I want to talk about it a little bit in the context of domestic terrorism. Domestic terrorism in a practical sense, as a prosecutor, is, it's definitional. There's not a lot of sort of straightforward domestic terrorism federal charges. It's something that attaches to other things. And there's some strategies there. I think we felt like it was in some ways duplicative of the civil rights violations of the hate crimes. I don't think that's truly the case. I mean, there are certainly ways to use domestic terrorism as a standalone, perhaps as an aggravator in the death penalty context, or to use it in the narrative. But I think strategically, it just wasn't a great tool to use in the context of this case. And I think, as Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General at the time, said, that hate crimes were the original domestic terrorism, or civil rights violations were the original domestic terrorism. And I think there's something to that. So I guess my only thought on it is that there can be a lot of academic discussion about that, but there's a very practical discussion to be had. And I think for anyone prosecuting these cases, you've got to look at it as part of your case narrative and sort of what it gains you in the trial process. And that's sort of what we tried to do, and ended up not really using it through the case, and instead focused on the hate crime, the civil rights violations, and tried to steer a narrative around that theme of hate. I'm going to talk about this briefly. Roof had a GPS in his car. We pulled that, downloaded it, and he was in Charleston all the time in the months leading up to the crime. And to a date, he did not come to Charleston without going by the church. And what we found through the GPS device was, literally him casing the church, stopping in front of it, and constantly getting a feel for when people were there, when they weren't there, in security. A lot of information that he put out there about his intent and his hatred. He really took every angle he could. He had a journal in his car. This is a picture of it. He had his own sort of stylized emblems. The 1488 is a traditional sort of symbol. 14 are the 14 words of David Lane. 88 I mentioned before, and then some different runes and things that he has here as symbols. And then the journal was replete with his ideology. And so his manifesto, which again, you know, as the internet has taken hold and that kind of notoriety is available, this unfortunately becomes more and more common. But it wasn't just the journal found in his car. It was an online website that had the same type of information. He titled it The Last Rhodesian, put it up just before he drove to Charleston, and, you know, had a couple of links. The picture is from the movie Romper Stomper. Russell Crowe was in that movie, and he's a white supremacist who's killed. And so Roof created that website, called it The Last Rhodesian. And, you know, he had this study and this infatuation with countries who had a minority white governance that ruled over a majority of African American or minority groups that would be minorities here. So he identified Rhodesia as one of the last countries that had a white minority ruling party, as well as South Africa for apartheid. And that's what those patches are on his jacket. So he was, you know, those were his type of symbols. And then tied to the website were hyperlinks to photos, and I could go into detail on these, but certainly multiple locations that have white supremacy symbolism in this Charleston area. And then again, this is just more of that. So his glorification of that symbolism. We found lists in his car that had African-American churches listed. This is a video of him doing target practice. I'm gonna skip over it because we're just about out of time. But, you know, extensive evidence of premeditation and preparation. This is a journal that was found inside of his cell. So even after the shooting, this is 6 weeks after, he wrote this out. It was seized during an internal search. He said he couldn't go another day without doing something. He couldn't live with himself seeing these things happen. Says sometimes in his cell, he thinks about how nice it would be to watch a movie or eat some good food or drive his car, but then he remembers how it felt and knew he had to do something. So, you know, he doubles down on his belief. Another page, he says, I would like to make it crystal clear, I do not regret what I did. I am not sorry, I have not shed a tear for the innocent people I killed. And so what we see is not just his rhetoric leading up to the crimes, but then a doubling down, a reiteration in the weeks following. And obviously that was powerful in the penalty phase. So we presented that along with sort of the victim impact evidence. And I think it was fairly convincing in terms of the jury's recommendation as to penalty. You know, we presented evidence that he was wearing these shoes from the jail during jury selection. You know, even in front of the jury, white supremacy symbolism on his jail shoes. You know, we tried to use as much as we could to sort of represent the victims in indirect ways, showing who they were. And I want to show one last clip. This is Chris Singleton, the young man that played for the Cubs. He put this video on Twitter, I believe. I'm gonna play it briefly. I think it's a pretty good indication of the type of evidence we presented at the penalty phase.
Being therapeutic. Better to my moms. Promise I won't let you down. Anything I do. Listen. Mama, I hope heaven's treating you well. I'm stuck here living on earth, and sometimes I feel like hell without the hatred and the violence and the killing going on. Mommy, this world is so cold without you here to keep me warm. I look, have my little brother in here. He got your eyes. I look, have my little sister in here. She got your smile and me. I got that wisdom that you and God help provide to keep me all out of trouble and to never lose my pride. A man took your life in the middle of a church, and when I think about it, mama, I just pray it didn't hurt. But I know that pain is temporary. Heaven lasts forever, but the thought of you hurting mama don't make it any better. I promise I'm gonna take care of my bro and sis and always be there for them when they need a hug and a kiss. And love is stronger than hate. Your mama, you told me this. I'm hoping you hear this letter from me, your son Chris. I can't see it coming down my eyes, so I gotta make this song cry. I know what to do with all this pain inside, so I gotta make this song cry. They killed my mother and I don't know why, so I gotta make this song cry. Can't see it coming down my eyes, so I gotta make this song cry.
All right. Right. So I think that's, Chris didn't testify. We used that, I think, to show the impact on the family. And I think that was arguably just as effective as presenting yet another witness in the penalty phase. One last thing I'm going to cover, and then I think I'm at the end of my time. This is Roof's closing argument in the penalty phase. And without diving into the details, he fired his attorneys in the penalty phase and represented himself, and said to them, to the jury, that he realized he didn't have to do it. He didn't have to do anything. No one made him do it, but he meant what he said, and that was that he felt he had to do it. He still felt that way. So even in the penalty phase, he is hanging on to that belief that he had to make that impact, to make that statement. And no surprise, the jury was out shortly with a recommendation of death. And I will say the defense lawyers on the case were outstanding. He did not do himself any service getting rid of them. I think they would have certainly presented a strong case and did an outstanding job throughout. So that's, I think we're at the end here. I know y'all are on a clock for a CLE. I'm happy to stay and answer any questions. Alyssa had emailed me or texted me one quick question about racial composition of the jury. We were very thorough in the jury selection process, and there's, especially in the death penalty context, a lot of attention paid there for a variety of reasons. But I can't remember the exact makeup of African Americans to white jurors, but I do know that when we filed the motions and responded, it tracked with the composition in the local area, if not the rest of the country. And that there were certainly multiple African Americans on the jury. I frankly can't remember the exact number, but I do know that it was an issue, and it is often an issue in all cases. But certainly we try to make sure that we one, use our strikes in an appropriate way, but also obviously in this case it's just how it turned out to be almost spot on with the local population. So I think Alyssa can field any other questions, and I'm happy to answer those.
Yes, well, number one, thank you so much for your time and for telling us a lot about the case. We all learned a lot, and it's obviously a very horrific and sad story, but we're lucky to have you tell us how you were able to handle the case and try it. A couple questions that we've received. Hold on here, I want to go in order. The first is, so you obviously tried the federal case. Was there a state prosecution, and how did that play out?
Yeah, and it was so, I came out of the state system, worked with the elected official here in South Carolina. We call them solicitors, not DAs, but I came out of that office, and I'm still very close with the folks there. And so there was consistent communication between the two offices, and there's a competing process there, right? And the way I see it is, on a case like this, nobody is going to be expected to back down, and nobody should expect anything less than the full resources of every available office. So we were running, in some ways, parallel tracks, but there's different investigative tools available federally. For instance, the FBI agents were able to get to Roof a lot faster because they have offices near North Carolina. The governor of South Carolina gave local police her airplane, or whatever it is, her plane to use to get to North Carolina, but FBI was there already. And so, if somebody's willing to talk, you want to get that statement as quick as you can. And so that's a pretty good example of how the federal and state investigators worked. On the prosecution side, it got a little bit contentious at times, but I'll tell you, it really, knowing the people involved and the elected official here, it was all with an eye towards no one's going to back down. Everybody's going to want to try the case and do their best. And I don't begrudge that to anybody. It's frankly what we should expect. And so it was contentious at times, but only in a well-intentioned way. And so the real issue that came up was primary jurisdiction, which involves ultimately where somebody serves their sentence. So if a defendant is in state custody before you get federal charges, which we had in this case, the state charges were issued first. There's a concern about them serving their state time first. So it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a federal prosecution. But the reality is, the state court judge continued the state case. The federal lawyers moved for a speedy trial. Our judge called our case first, and so we were the first ones up, and then we resolved the primary jurisdiction issue really through the Bureau of Prisons and found a workaround. So he's serving his federal sentence. Ultimately, the state then withdrew their death penalty notice, and he pled guilty to the state charges and is serving a life sentence, sort of as a backup to the federal death sentence.
Thank you. Somebody else asked, what issues did defense attorneys raise during the trial, and how you or your office try to avoid making a martyr of Dylann Roof to other white supremacists?
Yeah, so the first question about the attorneys, I think in a case like this, I mean, they were clearly, and this has been made public, we're putting forth a mental health mitigation case. So not arguing that he was incompetent, or at least early on, not going to argue that he was incompetent or that he was insane. So not an affirmative defense to guilt, instead presenting it as mitigation at the penalty phase. As most of you probably know, there's in a bifurcated case like that, that makes it the mitigation evidence of mental health not admissible in the guilt phase. So he kept his lawyers through the guilt phase, and they tried to bring in some of the mental health evidence, but it was a challenge. And so they really weren't able to get very far with that. I think they did a good job with it, trying to point out parts of the evidence that maybe showed some indicators of mental health issues or symptoms. But I think we were happy to litigate that as well. I mean, Roof did not want to present that evidence, and so his way of avoiding that evidence getting in front of the jury or in front of the public, frankly, was to fire his lawyers in the penalty phase, and that tied their hands. And so they weren't even there in the penalty phase except as standby counsel. That precluded the mental health evidence. And as he told the judge during a hearing, he would rather, risk receiving the death penalty than have his message compromised by, having sort of mental health evidence presented that would somehow weaken it or show that it was not, a fully thought out or a rational message. I'll say that we in the capital case context, you don't necessarily get to what your experts would say. So I really don't know what our experts would have said about his mental health, but I do know in the competency hearings, I think he probably had some social anxiety disorder. And I think the defense was raising it as more of a him being on the autism spectrum disorder somewhere that would mitigate his culpability to sort of go against the death penalty or make it not an appropriate punishment. So as far as trying to avoid making him a martyr, it happens in a lot of these cases. I'm not sure there's we're worried about it, but that was what the case was. And if he had gotten up there on a soapbox and really pushed, he probably had that opportunity. We worried about it. We were ready for it, but it's happened in some of these cases, and I wish there was a better answer, but it's his day in court. And if he wants to get up there, we can object to it, but in a penalty phase, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to avoid. So I think you just got to be ready for it and, know how to react with it. I don't think it would have helped his chances, frankly, but yeah, he could have. I think his own sort of personality made it hard for him to be too articulate in those ways. And so I don't think he did a great job with it, but yeah, it was a concern and a possibility we just had to account for.
Thank you. One attendant or attendee wants to know if you used an expert witness to explain how the defendant was radicalized online. If you didn't use an expert, just curious to know how you presented that evidence.
So we did not use one, but we prepared one and had one ready to go. I think it may, we certainly, as you would expect, had a lot of things prepared, a lot of experts ready that we, like in any trial, as you sort of get through it and you realize where you are, you realize it just may be too much or unnecessary. you know, we sort of focused on the hatred theme, and his writings and his articulation of it, I think, were sufficient. And, you know, our feeling, especially in the penalty phase, was that it was a really difficult emotional case for the jurors, for the people in the courtroom. You know, we had lived with it, we were ready for it, but I think, you know, for 12 jurors and the alternates to walk in and just out of the gate have survivors talking about their children dying, you know, while talking to them was hard. And so it ended up that we felt like we were in a pretty good place in terms of getting the evidence we needed presented, that adding the experts on sort of, and it wasn't so much on internet radicalization, it was more on the white supremacy symbolism, but certainly the concept there of where you would learn that and where it's available was there. And, you know, we looked into the sort of the lone wolf radicalization stuff, and that was an aspect of it. But, you know, I think by the time we got to that point in the trial, it felt like it had explained itself well, and would have been maybe just a little unnecessary. So we ended up cutting it, but we definitely looked at it, had an expert ready, and just, you know, kind of backed off of it.
Has Mr. Roof appealed his case?
Yes, it's currently on appeal. We filed our brief recently, and when I say we, Department of Justice Appellate Division, as well as the Civil Rights Division, is leading on that appeal. I am thankfully not. I don't mind writing, but that's a bit much for me. But yeah, he's appealed it, and, you know, it's in the appellate process. And look, I get that's one of the frustrations with, you know, with capital prosecutions. You know, it can be a very long time, and you know, executions may not happen, and we've seen all kinds of different results there. But I think as a prosecutor, you just have to look at it like, you know, when you prosecute a case, you look for the appropriate penalty, and the most significant cases should get the most significant penalties, whatever that might be. And so, you know, it can be a little long and you know, frustrating to some folks, but I think I try to look at it like we are trying to get what the appropriate penalty is, and the rest of it is sort of beyond our control. Not to say that we shouldn't account for it, but you can't get too hung up on it.
Sorry, there are a couple more questions that just came in. So given how emotionally heavy these topics are, one person wants to know how you navigate the potential negative impacts of this on you personally, your fellow team members, and just generally how you practice self-care, you know, both during the investigation and especially through trial.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, it depends on your level of preparation for it, right? Like, you certainly have to be cognizant of how a case is going to affect you, so you're not distracted. But I think most folks that sort of work these type of cases, I don't want to say you get used to it, but you learn that the urgency of your responsibility in the courtroom exceeds that reaction. So I have never had sort of interference from my emotional reaction. I think what I tend to find is that I don't do a great job of anticipating other folks. So like when we're doing some of the crime scene stuff, it was really hitting hard on some of the family members in the courtroom. And like, you know, I don't want to say it surprised me, but I had not timed it. I should have moved through it quicker, and, you know, I thought I had it right. And so, yeah, I mean, it's certainly hard on folks that don't expect it. You know, court recorders, people from our office, paralegals and things like that. But, you know, for those of us that have the time to prepare, we certainly have the time to sort of process it and know what the responsibilities are. And, you know, fortunately, the department provides a ton of support. You know, we have emotional assistance folks and our victim advocates. So to the extent it becomes wearing on us, we certainly have the resources to sort of deal with it. But yeah, it's a challenge to not let it affect how you handle the case in the courtroom. But I don't know, for me, when I'm presenting the evidence, I am so sort of focused, if not anxious, about making sure I get things right, that it's you know, the emotion stuff doesn't really register a whole lot. You know, and those of you that have prosecuted cases probably have some feel for that. I mean, you know, I don't like it when witnesses break down, but I know that's going to happen, and I try to sort of steer around it and know where that's going to be. So it's sort of like that.
Makes sense. So you have to kind of tune out your own emotions sometimes during these trials. Otherwise, it's probably almost impossible to do the work. You know, Mr. Williams, thank you so much for such an informative and powerful presentation. It was so moving to hear the personal stories of the victims in this case. I think some stories like these kind of get lost, and there's a lot of focus on the accused. I'm sure our audience learned a lot about the difficulties in investigating and trying a high-profile case like this one. For those of you watching, please be on the lookout for emails about other upcoming events we have, including the final panel about human trafficking in our series. That last panel is going to be this coming Thursday. We will be taking a break from these panel discussions or these presentations over the holidays, but have several exciting presentations coming up early next year. So stay tuned. Hope you keep an eye out on our emails. And again, Mr. Williams, thank you so much for your time and for a very inspirational presentation today.
Thank you. Thank you all for bearing with me. I appreciate it.
Take care. Bye, everybody.